Doesn't fit.
I don't have room in my workshop for a jointer or even a bandsaw, so I'm building 3 jigs that will essentially replace those tools. And they'll make me a better woodworker, but only if I have the right blades. Since I literally don't have room for a jointer, figuratively, no, literally, there's not enough space, I'm first building a jig that will help me edge joint boards. It will also allow me to put tapers on my work pieces. For example, if I'm making 4 legs for a desk or a table, it will really help me add some style and character, but we'll get to that in a little bit. This jig is basically, not even basically, it is just 2 pieces of plywood, and then we'll add some hardware very soon. A stop block is used for repeatable cuts, but there are no repeatable cuts in this jig. So why am I using it? Your guess is as good as mine. I think it's because I'm so used to using it, it was just muscle memory. So what does it mean to edge joint a board? It means to cut a perfectly straight edge that is 90 degrees to the face of your workpiece. This is especially important when you want to glue 2 boards together and your edges aren't perfectly straight, which they often aren't when you first get them. Here I'm cutting 2 slots on the base of the jig that are a 1/2 inch wide for the T-bolt, and I initially thought 1/2 inch would be wide enough. I was wrong, which is a fairly common occurrence these days. If you are a keen observer, which I know that you are, you will see that I have a router table in my shop, so you may be thinking, why don't you just use a router table for these cuts? That would be a lot easier and simpler. Well, I decided to use the palm router because more people have palm routers than router tables, and I wanted this build to be accessible to as many people as possible. The slots that I'm routing in on the top piece and the base piece will make this jig adjustable so you can cut a ton of tapers and work with a bunch of different widths of lumber. Oh, and the clamps I'll be using for this jig, I am really excited to share with you because I didn't even know they existed until a few years, yes, a few years after I started woodworking. And they are very nice for this type of jig. Time to route in a 1/4 inch slot in the top piece so that the T-bolt that comes with the hold down clamps can go all the way through. Well, the bolts won't go all the way through because it was the wrong size, but I'll explain that in painstaking detail very soon. Because this 1/4 inch bit is pretty thin, it's only a 1/4 of an inch, I'm doing this groove in 2 passes because I thought 1 pass would just be too much for the bit to handle.
All right, let's fit this clamp on the top piece. What the heck? Doesn't fit.
That's what she said.
Well, that's silly.
Okay, I ran into a little bit of a snag. Not even a snag, less than a snag. I'd call it a hiccup. I think we can fix this pretty easily. So of course, I did not check the exact width of this bottom part of the bolt. So when I went to fit it in, there was a problem. The bolt is exactly a 1/4 inch, so it fits really nice into the 1/4 inch slot I made. But when I put it in, you can see that the bottom does not fit in the 1/2 inch slot that I put into the board. So to make sure that this part recesses into the groove, I'm just going to widen the 1/2 inch groove a little bit. No big deal. Then there's the top piece. I assumed that the T-bolt that came with the clamp was a 1/4 inch like this bolt. I was wrong. It's obviously thicker. The bolt is wider than a 1/4 inch, and this part is wider than a 1/2 inch. So not only do I have to widen the 1/2 inch groove like I have to do on the base piece, I also have to widen the 1/4 inch groove as well, so that the clamp bolt will be able to fit. And this could all have been avoided if I would have double checked the size of the bolts before I made the grooves, but why would I do that? That makes far too much sense. Okay, time to set everything back up and widen these grooves. Not a huge deal. As I always say, woodworking is 90% building and the other half is fixing your mistakes. I'm always saying that. Originally, when I started woodworking years ago, I made a jointing jig that used toggle clamps, which meant that the top piece was not adjustable. And it worked okay for jointing boards, but I couldn't cut any tapers or angled cuts with it. Then soon after, I made a jig very similar to this one, but I didn't film any of it. Film? I I guess record is the right word because there's no film in my camera. So I'm now making a new and improved version and sharing it with you because I think it would be helpful. Ooh, this little guy is probably my favorite part of the jig. I'm adding this stop block on the back for repeatable cuts. And this will be pretty necessary because at least for me, I'll put a taper on either 2 or 4 of the legs. I guess you could put a taper on 1 or 3 of them, but that would be, let's say, a very innovative look. But hey, don't let me stifle your creativity, you do you. One of the reasons I love this jig so much is it makes my projects look like I'm a better woodworker than I actually am. Although I truly believe I'm a mediocre woodworker at best at building most things, I have to say I think I'm, dare I say it, pretty good at building workshop furniture and jigs. And I make detailed written and video plans for pretty much every piece of shop furniture and jig you see in my workshop. And those are at thomascustomwoodworks.com. Okay, shameless plug over. But I do like to mention it because the reason I make those plans is because I think they'll really help a lot of people. Especially people just starting out who don't want to take the time to design and figure out all the measurements of the furniture that they need to start building stuff. The reason you would need this jig is even the cleaner side of your workpiece may not be perfectly straight, but the edge of this jig is. After you joint one edge, you'll put that side against your rip fence to joint the other edge. This next jig will make it so your projects don't fall apart. If you currently or in the future want to make small boxes, picture frames, or signs, you're gonna need this spline jig. Miter joints are notoriously a little weaker than other joints, so a spline is something that you will put in your mitered corners to keep your project together. And although it's visible, it can actually look really nice. I like to accentuate the spline, as you'll see in the sign that I'm making, and I'm using a walnut spline in a white oak frame. This jig can be customizable to any table saw. You don't have to have the table saw that I have. And tens of people have asked me over the years what plywood I use for all my shop furniture and jigs, and I just use shop grade birch plywood. It's one of the cheaper options at my local lumberyard, and the grain can sometimes have some really cool character. Here I'm cutting the pieces that will hold the wood project, which I've creatively named the wood holders, and we'll get to that in a minute. But when cutting the side pieces for this jig, I cut each piece about 1/4 inch higher than my rib fence. I wish I could say I thought of that first, but I originally cut them the exact same height as my rib fence, or at least tried to. I cut them a little short and then they didn't work. So 1/4 inch higher than the fence will give you a little wiggle room, and who doesn't love to wiggle in a room? I know I do. Another thing that I did that protected me from myself is making the top piece a little narrower than it needed to be. That just ensured that the top piece would not get in the way of the jig being perfectly 90 degrees. There are a lot of jigs out there that in my opinion are overcomplicated. They do 10 different things, and whenever you switch the function, you have to remember how it goes together, and it takes time to switch it. It's just too much for me. So I make my jigs very simple. They get the job done so I can make what I want to make efficiently. Now when I'm attaching the top piece, I am not clamping the side pieces to my rib fence, because if I did that, my jig wouldn't move and then it'd be useless. I've heard of other people putting a piece of blue painter's tape on each side of the rip fence, giving it that wiggle room we talked about earlier, but I haven't done that, so I can't recommend it. This strategy of a soft and nurturing touch worked perfectly well. Now, there are rare times when I sell some things I make. Most of the time these days I just give it away. But when I was starting out, a great way to earn some money to replenish the funds I was spending on this hobby was to sell some of the items that I made. And because the joinery on some of those earlier items was equivalent to Scotch tape, I've recently wondered, have any of them fallen apart or exploded? Perhaps. So this jig is to ensure that certain projects don't fall apart or explode. However, if your splines are not the right size, it could ruin your project and be very tricky to fix. I'll go into detail about what size your spline should be when I'm inserting my splines later in the video, but first let's talk bandsaws. Specifically, we're going to create a very simple jig that does the main thing that a bandsaw does, so you don't need to buy a bandsaw. And that thing is resawing. I know a bandsaw does more than that, but that is the main thing that I would use it for. And the cool thing is that jig is very similar to this spline jig with a few differences. One of those differences is you want this resawing jig to go the full depth of the table saw compared to the spline jig, which goes about half the depth. But there is a big similarity between these two jigs. You want a specific table saw blade for both. If you don't have the right blade, you're gonna have a bad time and it's not gonna cut very well. Oh boy, I clamped the sides to the rip fence when securing the top, but now the jig doesn't move. I actually did think this was a mistake when I did it, but it ended up being a good thing because you do not want this jig to move when you're using it. Now, resawing a board is the process of cutting a board along its length, which is along the grain, to create thinner boards. And you'll see me do this in a second, but you have to use a specific blade when resawing. I won't get into blade geometry, chemistry? Blade psychology, but you're going to want to use a 24 tooth blade when resawing, also called a ripping blade. Because there are so few teeth on this blade, it has bigger gullets, which will allow the massive amount of sawdust you will be accumulating during these cuts to escape, and it will create a much better cut. If you have more teeth, it won't cut as well and could be potentially dangerous. I'm sorry that was a little serious. Let's lighten the mood. Why shouldn't you trust trees? Because they're all kind of shady. You're welcome? I'm cutting about 3/4 of an inch on each pass, so this will take multiple passes, but if you have a smaller table saw, you may want to go down to a 1/2 inch each pass. I'm not cutting all the way through on my final pass because of safety, and I'm not a big fan of danger, even though it is my middle name. You'll have to talk to my parents about that one. I'm using this blade to finish off the cut, which was a mistake. A handsaw is the right tool, but this type of handsaw took forever. It didn't even feel like it was going through the wood. Now that my right arm is twice the size of my left, it is done. It literally took me about 15 minutes to finish off the cut compared to the saw I'll show you next, which took me about 2 or 3. For this piece of yellow heart, I'm using a Japanese pull saw and I'm using the side for ripping. I'll put a link for this saw in the description. You do not have to use this brand, just get a nice saw, preferably one that's double-sided, one side for cross-cutting, one side for ripping, and use the ripping side for this application. Okay, back to splining, which I'm pretty sure is very similar to spelunking. The most important part of this jig is something that I will tell you about in 20 minutes. Stay tuned. Sorry, that was just a hilarious joke. The most important thing about this jig is securing the wood holders at exactly 90 degrees. And I'm doing that with a drafting square, which was also my nickname in college. Am I right? I don't know what that means. I'll cut the wood holders to the exact same length and then secure them to the side of the jig with wood glue and some screws. And then the jig is pretty much done. All that's left is to put in some splines. I'm making a sign to put the splines in reference to one of my favorite TV shows, and I think one of the best TV shows of all time. I'll tell you towards the end of the video what show I'm talking about, but I'm purposely not going to tell you now because I want to see if you can figure it out sooner. So once you figure it out, comment below with the TV show and the time that you figured out what show I'm talking about. It would be very easy to lie here, but you're not a liar. And if you do lie, I'll know if you're lying based on how you typed the letters and numbers. One thing that always would frustrate me when people would talk about putting splines in their projects is they never told me how to actually make the wooden spline. They would talk extensively about the spline jig and how to actually cut the opening for the spline, but never talk about how they made the spline. You will see how I cut the splines in a little bit, but I'll tell you now. You just get a piece of wood that's as wide as you need it for the depth of groove you're cutting into your miter, and then you will just cut that piece of wood to the width of your spline groove. You'll secure it with a little glue, and bingo, bango, and bongo, you have a spline. The original piece of yellow heart that I bought was maybe 10 inches wide and about 5 feet tall, and it was $80. Yeah, I know. This guy doesn't want to spend a lot of money on tools, but will buy an $80 piece of wood. That's why the resaw jig I made earlier is so important, because I could use that one piece of wood for multiple projects if I just cut multiple slices out of it. I just changed the blade from an angled tooth to what is called a flat top grind. And this is important because since I'm cutting a wider groove, I'm going to use multiple passes, and I need that groove to have a flat bottom so the spline can fit flush inside. If I kept the angled tooth blade in my saw, which works great for most applications, the groove would not be flat, which wouldn't be the end of the world, but there'd be some gaps and it just wouldn't look as nice. You also may have noticed on that first cut, because of your keen observation skills, that I'm waiting until the blade stops before I pull the jig back through the blade. If something feels like it's kind of dangerous, it probably is. And I've gotten kickback from pulling a project back through a spinning blade, so I just don't do it anymore. I'm cutting my walnut spline to the right thickness as I explained earlier in the video, and I'm just securing it with some wood glue. Now, it is very important that you do not cut your spline groove too deep when using the spline jig. If you do, you could blow right through your frame and then it'll be visible from the front of the sign. That would be, as we call in the business, a big no-no. I hate to be so blunt, but if you don't know what show the sign is from by now, you're not gonna get it. It is from the show Ted Lasso. Jamie Tart doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo-doo. I'm a big fan of building workshop furniture that saves space and making jigs that are simple. So here's a video where I build a simple yet effective crosscut sled that I think you're really gonna like. I'll see you over there.